Um, Thank you all very, very much for coming here today. And to begin with, I'm Sean Coughlin. It says education correspondent at ODI, but in fact it's BBC. I'm not the subject of a surprising transfer overnight. Always available to offers, but I haven't changed just yet. Today we're here to mark the publication of the Global Education Monitoring Report, an annual occasion, which I think is one of the great underreported annual events of the year, because it's highlighting an injustice of quite epic proportions, really, and it's something we've almost got used to, the idea that hundreds of millions of people don't get the education to which they're entitled. You don't have to go that far on an aeroplane south from here to come across places where any education at all is something that eludes many families and all the opportunities which come from that. And I think it's very easy to lose sight of the significance of that. Today's report has a figure of 264 million young people who are missing primary and secondary education. It's the latest in a series of depressing figures that have come out just in the last few weeks. A few weeks ago, UNICEF came out with a figure showing that there had been almost no progress. They said zero progress in a decade on trying to get more children into school. And UNESCO's own stats body, its own institute, said that there were 600 million people in schools of such poor quality they were learning virtually nothing. And the UN isn't given to hyperbole, but they described that as being a staggering figure, and the idea that you could spend so many years in school, if you could get into school and leave without even the basic grasps of literacy and numeracy, I think is a sort of source of massive collective disappointment. And that sort of brings us on to the theme of this year's report, which is accountability. And where should we put the blame, I suppose, is no other way of thinking about it. If not blame, responsibility, which in many ways we all share. No shortage of people you could point to. Is it dodgy governments in countries where they're happy to pay for private jets but don't want to pay for public education? Is it ourselves? Do we look at our own Western governments who don't put enough into aid and then quibble about where it goes, and the whole narrative of cutting back on aid and this report also shows, I think there have been 6 successive years in which education has had a decreasing share of aid budgets. Is it us? Partly, who knows? One thing we can't say is we don't know, because this thin, slender tome with its many pages shows in vast detail the challenge ahead, and over recent years the work from our colleagues in Paris has shown the scale of what needs to be done. And also it shows glimmers of progress too. There has been progress. More people can read when this process began and write, and it shouldn't be without entire hope. But Will Smith is here with us to give us the current figure of where we're at and look at this through the lens of this year's theme, which is about accountability. Then we're going to have contributions from 2 speakers, and you'll notice there isn't a third speaker. The Department for Education has pulled out. So we're down to a select but fine group up here. And also our colleague from Kenya can't make it either. So we are, between ourselves, all here, and we'll share what we know. But it's more time for questions, more time for answers, more time for debate. We have Susan Nicolai here from the ODI, Home Turf. And we have Mike Treadaway from Education Data Lab, who will come at this from a perspective of data, particularly from his experience in the UK. But to kick us off, we're going to have Will Smith, who's going to give us a presentation on this year's report, and questions afterwards.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Sean, for the introduction. As Sean said, I'm Will Smith, the Senior Policy Analyst with UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report, and I'm here today to present our 2017-18 report on accountability in education meeting our commitments. I want to thank ODI for hosting, as well as contributing to the report, as well as everyone else in the room that's contributed to the report in some way. So, if, as we're going through here, you're interested in contributing to the discussion, please use the hashtag #CountOnMe or talk to us at @GemReport. So, we've made some progress in the last 15 years in education. We started thinking back from the beginning of the Millennium Development Goals. We have reduced illiteracy, more students in schools, but we still have quite a ways to go. So this report shows we still have 100 million youth that cannot read, 1 in 7 primary teachers are not trained, and education aid has stagnated with education in primary and secondary primary and secondary education actually decreasing over the last 6 years. So accountability is important to education and can help us fix some of these problems. When we looked at this report, we looked at all the different actors that have some responsibility for contributing to the Sustainable Development Goal 4. And we looked at all the different approaches that are currently used to hold these actors accountable. So we're going to take a little break and show a small video clip detailing these approaches.
All countries have committed to achieve equitable quality education by the year 2030. Governments are responsible for achieving this goal, but others have responsibilities too. Schools, teachers, parents and students, international organizations, private sector. Unfortunately, the challenge is large. Millions are not going to school, and many more are leaving school not having learnt enough. This year's Global Education Monitoring Report shows how accountability can help. Accountability helps show who is responsible for what, and how problems can be fixed. Governments are held to account by judges, parliamentarians, auditors, ombudsmen, and international organizations. But we all have the power to hold governments to account. The press, elections, and protests all play an important role. Schools must provide a safe and supportive learning environment. Governments can regulate, accredit, inspect, and monitor them. Parents can exercise control by taking part in school management or by choosing where to educate their child. Teachers teach, but they also do much more. They are guided by ethical codes. Evaluators observe them. Inspectors scrutinize them. Other teachers and the community also sometimes monitor their work. Parents must ensure students go to school well prepared. In some countries, they can be punished if they do not. Students must not disrupt other students' ability to learn and teachers' ability to teach. International organizations help determine our global goals, and member states can question their actions. Donors promise aid. Reporting and scrutiny can expose those falling short of their commitments. The private sector is increasingly influential. Regulations, codes of conduct, transparent contracts, and media scrutiny ensure private actors work for the greater good. Accountability matters. It really matters. But accountability systems don't always work. They can be unaffordable for poorer countries. If badly designed, they penalize the poorest, erode teacher motivation, and narrow the curriculum. The GEM report shows what is needed. Reporting to international bodies, auditing the budget, monitoring, and regulating. Transparency is crucial. Clear and accessible information shows who's responsible for what is being achieved, and when systems break down. Trust is more effective than penalty. Punishing those who don't achieve strong education results is counterproductive. What we need is to build capacity and to provide resources. We need adequate information about the way education systems are working, and for there to be genuine commitment. Let's get accountability right.
There we go. So, okay, well, as you saw from the video, there's quite a diversity of approaches used to hold this collection of actors accountable for their own responsibilities. When we look at accountability over time, we see the increasing emphasis on accountability. And our report shows that this is due to a lot of different factors, including a rapid diversification. So sometimes the successes and expanding enrollment in education has led to diverse provision, which has really challenged states for regulations. We see increased decentralization, increased information, leading to rapid calls for more transparency, as well as some challenges in the public sector meeting the needs of society. So for this report, we define accountability as a process to show who's responsible for what and helping individual actors meet those commitments. So before we get started, there's a few truths that came out of this report. So these essential truths start with the fact that ambitious education outcomes, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, rely on multiple actors fulfilling their shared responsibilities. Essentially, education is a collective effort. So, however, while responsibilities can be shared, accountability really cannot. So accountability relies on actors meeting their individual or institutional responsibilities. The challenge is, when we're creating accountability systems, is making sure we don't create systems where people are held accountable for outcomes beyond their control. So accountability doesn't work when we have people held accountable for outcomes beyond their control. For instance, teachers cannot be solely accountable for student results because there's multiple factors that go into student test scores. Additionally, accountability needs to be flexible. So we know that accountability mechanisms may be effective in some countries and in some contexts, and the same mechanisms or approaches may not be effective in others. While there are multiple actors that have responsibilities towards education, education essentially starts with government. So the government is the primary duty bearer for ensuring the right to education. And while all countries have signed on to an international commitment or an international treaty ensuring this commitment, only 55% of countries allow citizens to take the government to court for right to education violations. And just over 40% you've actually seen court cases on right to education violations. Civil society and international community needs to do more to try to push to make sure that the right to education is justiciable in the national legal framework. So this brief report is going to focus primarily on recommendations for government. So we know that this is where it starts, and so we'll be talking about recommendations for the design and implementation of a robust government system. What should governments do? So when we're designing a robust accountability system, we first need to start with creating space that will build trust. So inviting multiple stakeholders in. So this helps build trust by creating shared understandings. So, however, this is challenging in some places, as globally we know that 60% of teacher unions were never or rarely consulted on teaching material development at the national level. Additionally, we need to encourage better support for representative institutions, for instance, parliamentary committees for reviewing education policy. We know that in the United Kingdom, the Education Parliamentary Committee, those recommendations put out by the committee often looked very similar to the final policy recommendations put forth by government. Additionally, the government needs to develop credible education plans with clear lines of responsibility. The education plan is the national commitment, and it's the starting point for accountability in the country. And within these education plans, there needs to be clear budgets that are open to public scrutiny. Additionally, as far as transparency goes, governments need to publish national accountability monitoring reports regularly. But our review of national monitoring reports globally showed that really, since 2010, only 1 in 2 countries have published a national monitoring report on education. And when we look at annual reports, only 1 in 6 countries publish an annual education monitoring report. Governments also need to be able to establish clear regulations and standards. So, regulations need to be not just for public or private, but should cover both sectors. They need to be focused on equity, not just quality, and they need to be transparent and clear. Unfortunately, not all states or countries have regulations in place. For example, our review of regulations at the school level showed that in almost half of countries there are no regulations in place on class sizes. One example of clear and transparent regulations that have been useful is in Hong Kong, which has an online directory of private tutoring centers that meets the regulations that parents can go to see who qualifies. Additionally, accountability systems should be focused on building, not blaming. So, for instance, we've seen a rise in using student test scores to hold teachers and schools accountable globally. And we know that this has, well, the evidence shows that this has really very little impact on improving learning. So what this does do is that this undermines cooperation within schools. It leads to narrowing of the curriculum, teaching to the test, and shifting students into those untested groups. So a review of PISA participants that used test-based accountability from 2003 to 2015 showed that of the 11 countries that used test-based accountability, so linking student test scores to school performance, 5 countries saw some increase in learning, while 6 saw some decrease in that time. And a similar approach, looking at market-based accountability, where schools are supposed to correct their behavior to try to make sure that they've got parents coming into their school, we see that really the outcome of this is greater segregation across school districts. And while some countries have been able to remedy this by providing vouchers to help make sure the marginalized have access to schools, in other countries, those vouchers have really just been met by increased school fees. Governments also need to allow for democratic voice. This includes by ensuring we have freedom of the press, making sure citizens have formal avenues to voice their complaints, as well as holding free and fair elections. So media scrutiny can provide information to those who don't, a powerful media can provide information to those who don't typically have access to information. It can be the watchdog for government activity, and it can help make public important research reports. So autonomous institutions that have authority and listen to government or listen to citizen complaints are also very important. So ombudsman offices have done a lot to ensure the right to education in places such as Latin America and are key to making sure that citizens' voice are there. Regardless of how well designed an accountability system is, if you don't have the resources, capacity, motivation, and information, it's not going to be very effective in practice. So we need to think about how we are implementing accountability systems from the government as well. So first, the government needs to be transparent. They need to provide relevant and timely information. And this includes investing in information that actually provides feedback on how to build a stronger system. So this information needs to make sure that we're being judicious with it. So oftentimes there's information overload with our actors. So the information needs to be designed with a purpose in place as well, and be useful to those that the information is provided to. For instance, in Kenya, we know that 72% of parents, once they were provided with student literacy data, didn't know what to do with that. And as far as overburdening individuals with data, we know that 56% of teachers in England said that they have so much data that it seems to detract them from their real work. Governments also need to be committed. They need to be committed to fund education. So they should spend at least 6% of their GDP on education, or allocate 15% of their total government expenditure on education. However, our report identifies that 1 in 4 countries are missing hitting these benchmarks. So it can't just be the national governments that are funding education. Donors have a role to play too. So in their aid programs, donors should allocate 0.7% of income to aid, with at least 10% of that going to primary and secondary education. However, as I mentioned earlier, the share of aid to education has fallen for 6 years in a row, and is now sitting at under 7% relative to the 10% expected. We also need to be careful of results-based financing. So this is an increasingly used form of financing, similar to test-based or performance-based accountability. This is trying to promote performance by sanctioning and rewarding the government in this instance for their outcomes. However, when we look at results-based financing, we see that results-based financing actually tends to decrease intrinsic motivation of those providers and undermines country ownership. Finally, governments need to be supportive in building capacity. They need to set up strong institutions such as judiciary, the police, and auditors to detect and deter corruption in education. So corruption is a real issue in education. For instance, globally, there's a sense that construction is one of the more corrupt sectors. However, when we look at in the European Union, the risk of corruption for the education sector is actually greater than the risk of corruption for the construction sector. We also need to train teachers and school evaluators. So, oftentimes inspections tend to focus more on material things instead of looking at what's best for learning. And finally, there needs to be greater investment within the countries to make sure that they're representative in international organizations. As we mentioned earlier, there are multiple actors responsible for meeting these shared aims of education. That includes international organizations such as ourselves, and the governments have a lot to do with holding institutions like UNESCO to account. So accountability is often put forward as one of the solutions to the challenges we have in education. And at the GEM report, we welcome that, since initially the GEM report is an accountability tool. We also welcome it because we understand that without accountability, people often pull back and it leads to complacency. However, implementing accountability is a challenging task, and we suggest some caution, especially when we're talking about implementing it attached to narrow performance measures. So, I hope you can work with us to help us get accountability right, and we're looking forward to the rest of the conversation. So, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Will. Lots of big themes there. Just to begin with, I think we'll get some responses from our two panellists. Perhaps starting off with Susan, Senior Research Fellow at the ODI. What do you make of that? What are your initial reactions to this year's report?
First of all, I'm pleased to be hosting this year, and so thanks for Will for coming and the other panelists. It's been really interesting. ODI worked with the report team in thinking through the recommendations and how to frame that, the research and the findings that they had put together. And that process really threw up a number of tensions, which I'll remark on in a bit. But I think from the overall sense that we get from the report is how central accountability is to actually delivering on some of the big challenges that we've got from SDG 4, but how complex it is as well. And there are all of these different angles that you really need to be looking at and thinking about in terms of accountability. It is a government role, but there's lots of other actors that need to be involved to make accountability work right. And there's the different levels of accountability as well around so formal laws and regulations, but you've also got the intrinsic motivations and the extrinsic motivations, and a lot of dynamics that are going on there. And that looks very different in every context. So I think my big takeaway is the complexity. And I guess I would congratulate the team for really trying to tackle some of the complexity in this report, but there's a lot of questions and a lot of challenges as one actually looks at implementing and addressing accountability in different education systems.
Okay. Mike, wearing your data hat, what's your headline take? What are the breaking news on this? How do you frame your action?
Maybe I'll start with one thing, because my background is working within the UK context, data within school improvement and accountability as part of that. When I have to be honest, I skimmed the big report last night. I certainly didn't read all of it. But there was one headline on page 293 that I thought should be like imprinted on every page, which said, accountability is part of a solution, but should be designed with humility. And I can remember in the early days when we set up the Fisher Family Trust Data Analysis Project, one of the slides on the first thing we ever did back in 2000 was data doesn't provide answers, it just provides questions. You need to use it along with other things to get to answers. And I think that's a thread that needs remembering right through that, as you've referenced a number of times, Will, about the use of data within accountability. If I sort of pick up one example for now, maybe illustrate a few later, but I was reflecting on your comment about teacher perceptions in the UK. And I think probably the perception is they have the extra workload to collect data that they have to do is a problem. And I've often thought, if I was in their position now, I might think the same. Because it seems to me a lot of teachers have to do a lot of work to collect data, but what do they get back? They often just get back targets. They don't get stuff that's diagnostic. They don't get stuff back that's actually going to inform teaching and planning. And yet, ironically, if you look at the government's teacher standards document, there are actually 20 statements in there about use of data within teaching. One of them refers to pupil performance. The other 19 are about using data to inform teaching and planning. So I have a suspicion that if teachers got more back, they might regard it as less of a problem.
Okay. Well, we'll have a few questions up here first, and then we'll open up to yourselves. And I'll ask the panelists as well as Will. One thing that struck me during that was that we're looking at other countries and saying, here are some ground rules for how accountability might work. These are the conditions in which it might grow. But can I ask Will, first of all, can you do it from outside? Every country has its own education system. You think in the context of the UK, there are 4 different sets of accountability systems, Ofsted, and different systems in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. Can you impose, can you export, can you offer someone else something, or does it have to come from within? Because one of the most striking things I often think about these, you mentioned PISA data on that countries that have done particularly well, come from nowhere, places like Vietnam and South Korea, are conspicuous by doing it for themselves and in their own way, and in a way that's very much to do with their own history and culture. Can you do it from outside, or is it something that has to happen spontaneously and organically?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, one of the keys to the report is talking about how accountability is, as Susan talked about, very complex, and so you have different approaches that may work in different contexts. And so just because something works in one country doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work in another country. So there does need to be a lot of caution with trying to implement accountability systems across national lines because of the unique context of the country. I think when we look at the role of donors, even the role of communities, we talk about some concerns with perhaps parents or community members that are invested at some point in their children's education but may not be invested to others, or donors that are really invested in a limited time, but once that money dries up, what happens? So we start talking about, well, what is really sustainable in accountability systems? And oftentimes implementing accountability from the outside isn't a sustainable practice. So it does need to be something implemented with the government, ingrained to make sure the government's meeting their own commitments. And so there have been successful practices in social accountability where it was a local community that was helping government inspectors actually collect. So it was using the systems there and really intertwining the community with something that was already in place, so that once the community moved away, that there was a strength and capacity of the government. So I think that's one of the keys.
What do you think,
Susan? When we were working with the report on thinking through recommendations, and as I was reflecting in preparation for today as well, one of the things I was trying to think back on is, okay, how does one describe the role of accountability? What does it make a difference on in terms of an education system? And was looking back at some research and analysis that we did across sets of education systems, where we were trying to look at what are the drivers for really increased access or improving quality, and looking at the links between things like politicians prioritizing visible change and the kind of data elements that link to access really successfully often, and when parents, when communities see those changes in access, that can be a really positive feedback loop, and that's a very visible change. Whereas things like improvements in quality are not as visible, and particularly for communities that don't have a history or culture of engaging in schools in certain ways. And so how does one make those elements of education that are perhaps less visible and part of a feedback loop? And I think the thing that is quite interesting in reflecting back at those sets of case studies, and we looked across countries like Ethiopia, Cambodia, Indonesia, Chile, Kenya, to try to understand a little bit about the dynamics behind this. I think what was really interesting to see is what happened when there was specific effort to engage beyond beyond central government actors. And so I think while governments hold formal accountability and regulation systems are set up at that level, there really needs to be a careful look at how the incentives and the politics of the system feed back and support change and support politicians who are advocating for change. And so an example of one place where there's been some really interesting experiments with that and attempts to create better feedback loops would be in Chile. And there's lots of challenges with the system in Chile, and the stratification in terms of the education system would be front and center as a concern. But there's been some really interesting experiments that they've done with both national level testing in the form in a test called SIMSE, that provides some interesting feedback loops that help local governments decide on resource allocation, on focusing on capacity building and where they need to be putting their resources, and some effort and some engagement in international testing systems like TIMSS and PISA, to help gauge where the country is going. And I think the engagement at a decentralized level with those testing systems is one of the things that's made a difference to improved quality as a whole in the country. Another example where there's been lots of efforts of engagement, and I'm sure many of you in the room are aware of efforts like ACER in India and TAWEZA in Kenya and Tanzania, and the efforts to really share information about levels of quality at school level and try to engage citizens in that, in improving the quality. And I think that's an example of where engagement can lead to some improvements, but has real challenges. And I think it was mentioned, how do people know what to do with the information is a big challenge in terms of accountability as well. So just reflecting on some of those experiences.
Okay, thanks. And Mike, again, we turn to you as our statsman down there. How do you think, we had lots of figures being quoted at us there in the presentation. What are the sort of strengths of data in this? What can it bring? And also, what are the risks? It's a thing we can get too bogged down in numbers and whatever. But how does it work? How does it work?
Okay. I might challenge being described as a statsman though, because my background is teaching and local authority advisory stuff and learning enough statistics to do the stuff, not the other way round. So I often ask questions that real statisticians don't ask, which turn out to be quite important ones sometimes. Okay. Perhaps a key perspective about this transportability stuff across is too often people try to understand what systems rather than trying to understand what those systems are doing in a particular context and then transport the understanding of what it does and develop systems. And I often like to illustrate things with real cases, and this is just a very simple illustration, but it illustrates the sort of perspective I think too many schools get in terms of what are we expected to do rather than how can we become confident in what we're doing so that when we're inspected, we'll be okay? And this goes back to the sort of mid-90s when in primary schools in the UK, sort of checklists that you would record about pupils seemed to grow like a disease. I don't know if you remember, there was a time when on the news there was going to be a shortage of baked beans, so everybody rushed into the supermarket and they suddenly were sold out of baked beans. Well, the same thing happened with checklists. Teachers would go off maybe on professional development courses, and they'd come back and say, we need to add these things to our checklist because this school down the road has got them on our checklist. And these things grew and grew. And I was asked by a primary school I was working with, because I was in a local authority context at the time, just to go and review their systems for assessment. And I spent a day in there. And I can remember the session at the end, it was quite a big primary school, and I said to them, why are you recording all this stuff in the checklist? Because the feedback I had from individual teachers was there was way too much information. They didn't use that. What they mainly used were a small number of comments about individual pupils that the previous teacher had recorded and used that to inform what they were thinking about the new class. And I can't remember if it was the head or the assessment coordinator said, but isn't this what we're expected to do? And I pointed out to them that the criteria for inspection said schools should be using assessment to inform teaching and improve. It doesn't specify how you do it. And I think that to me is a real illustration of the sort of issue we often get into about portability, if you like, of accountability and so on, that it's about, as long as you've got the system in place, it's okay, rather than do we really understand what the benefits are of that. I think data has been, if you look over the last 20 years, which is sort of my involvement of data in UK education, it's been a real mixed bag. There have been some real positives. I can think of schools where they've been able to, who were often struggling quite a lot, but maybe use some very sort of forensic diagnostic data to be able to say, we're struggling with lots of areas, but there may be 10% of areas where we're actually doing reasonably well. So let's learn internally from those 10% and build up from that. And schools in those situations have often gone on leaps and bounds. On the other hand, too often data is used in a very sort of deterministic way. Back to that point about humility. If one bit of data tests something, test it against another bit of data. Test it against some other things that you know. I mean, if 2 bits of data plus common sense all tell you the same thing, it's a pretty strong indication that you should get on and do it. If they tell you different things, you need to delve further. It's the data asking questions side. So I think there are broad learning things like that we can use to port data across. But equally, we need to maybe learn from some of the mistakes. I was looking through Kate's email beforehand, talked about sort of some of the questions we might come across, and one of it is, obviously in the UK there's a very detailed collection of data, both in terms of proof of performance and characteristics in school census, things like that. And what about countries that couldn't possibly afford to do things like that? And after my first reaction was a bit like Yoda in Star Wars. It was sort of, well, actually, most of the intermediate things are more dangerous than there was. So it's either do or not do. There is no try. So do it properly or don't bother doing it at all. But I think there are maybe lessons we can learn from the UK to pass on, perhaps, about, because sometimes it's professional development seems to be often to focus on what to do, and we should focus on what not to do. I mean, your report is actually very balanced, I think, on that, Will, and it's just as more important to identify what not to do as it is what to do. So crude approaches, years ago in the UK, we've dropped it now, we used to use things like benchmarks to evaluate schools, and we've got a loss of lessons from that it's blindingly obvious that doesn't actually work very accurately. And yet, if all you've got is whole school data, then you're often tempted to go into those sorts of approaches. And I think there are things, maybe detailed examples like that say this is where you can, what's the limits of data. I mean, I suppose if I was summarising broadly, over the last 20 years in the UK, we've had a vast increase in availability of data. We've had no increase in data literacy. And that, for me, is actually quite a dangerous situation. We need to build capacity. Your report references it. And I think what we haven't done in the UK enough is train people in being properly data literate. We should do that along with making the data available.
Bring Will back in again. One of the slides that came up there showed a call for greater transparency, and you talked about the need for democratic voice and the need to in a way, to use that to challenge inequality. It occurs to me that many of the countries I think you're speaking about are deeply unequal and by their nature not very open. How do you persuade countries to open up? Because the sort of thing you're offering and proposing isn't value-free. You're effectively proposing democratic values in countries that aren't very democratic, and ideas of equal access in schools which are countries which are inherently unequal. How do you get in with the education when you're so much against what the local politics are?
Yeah, I think I mean it's a challenging question, right? And so it actually goes back to your first one, like, are we promoting external values onto countries that may not be interested in hearing about this? So there's a lot. I guess this goes back to also, we all have a role to play. So the government may be quite restrictive in opening up and creating kind of these more formal channels. We obviously encourage it, but there are other avenues for citizens to take part. And so, for instance, putting public pressure, as Susan talked about, some of the ACER kind of more community-based assessments that have been able to use the media to put public pressure on things. We also know that, there's been some success in civil society taking the government to court, as long as it's, because the leadership in the government may change, but if you've got a justiciable right to education, there are some avenues there. So it may not just be, the policymakers may not be interested in expanding, but you may be able to work through the court system. So for example, in Brazil, they're able to take the government to court in Sao Paulo and ensure that kind of primary and early childhood education was available there. The other avenues, I mean, there are some avenues that aren't really well expanded, and we try to highlight some of those in the report. There are avenues for citizens to take, basically go straight to an international treaty body, or to work with a civil society organization to provide a parallel report to a treaty body. So it's more challenging when you obviously don't have the government. I mean, we just talked recommendations on all the government should do, and if the government came back and said, well, we're not doing any of this, that's quite a challenge. But there is still some hope. It takes some flexibility, it takes perseverance, and it takes understanding the options out there. And so hopefully our report is able to highlight some of those additional options.
And I suppose that in terms of the context of this morning's report, that the framework that's held by the international community to try and maintain accountability are the Sustainable Development Goals. Do you think they're very successful at doing that? Are they the right goals? Are they engaging with the public? Do they have the same sort of traction that possibly their predecessors, the Millennium Development Goals, had?
Well, I think we're still fairly early in the Sustainable Development Goals. I think it takes a long time for the public to really understand and embrace, and a lot of that is kind of our role as an international community to make sure that it's clearly communicated what the goals are and what the targets are, what we're trying to do, and why we're trying to do this. So at this point, I think 2 years in, it's not quite an accurate comparison. I think the Millennium Development Goals had a lot of momentum, partially because they were a smaller, more concrete piece. When we think about the education targets and the Millennium Development Goals, they were fairly simple to communicate. We're talking about primary education enrollment, and we're talking about gender parity. And those are pretty easy to communicate to people, partially because a lot of the way we communicate with people is we ask them to reflect on their own experiences, and people understand that, okay, I went to primary school and everybody should have the ability to go to primary school. And yes, boys and girls should be treated equally and have equal access to things. And when we think about some of the challenges in the Sustainable Development Goals, obviously we've got a lot more complexity when we think about the global and thematic indicators on the education side. There's 43 of them, which is quite an array.
A lot of goals, isn't it?
Yeah, quite an array, quite challenging to track for us. And when we think about something like SDG 4.7, we start talking about education for sustainable development or global citizenship. Those are things that aren't well defined yet, and they're things that haven't been a part of most of our traditional education. So when we talk to people about this, they start thinking about, well, what is this, and how does this really play a part? It didn't play a part in my education. And, I know it didn't play a part in my mom's education, so what does this look like? And so some of this is a little more challenging. Hopefully with good communication, we are still doing our best to try to clarify and simplify some of these into messages that are easy to communicate with the public. So hopefully down the road this momentum continues to build. But at this point, the breadth of the SDGs and some of the complexity of the messages, I think we have a ways to go. There's definitely great advantages to the SDGs because I think we're covering wider range of what education really is. But at the same time, from a communications perspective, it's really nice to have these concrete, simple messages that people can relate to.
Mm-hmm. And can I ask our other panelists as well, do you think that accountability is a nice way of saying responsibility or blame? Do you think we're a little bit sometimes unwilling to point the finger in these debates, or to actually, are we slightly dishonest about it? Do we actually say this should be sorted out and these people are not living up to their responsibilities?
Yeah, I think sometimes it is. And that links very much to the kind of legislation, regulation side of accountability, so the real formal accountability. And that's definitely a piece of the puzzle. But I think one of the things that I thought was nice about the report is that it went beyond just looking at that formal kind of accountability, and also really emphasized the fact that there are these different pieces of implementing an effective accountability system. And in the set of recommendations, there's really a triad of elements that they highlight. One is about information, which we've talked quite a bit about already in terms of data, but there's lots of elements to that information that that are important around being effective, all the way from availability to literacy to the use of the information. The second piece of that triad of an accountability system that was emphasized is around resources. And when one looks at the fact that only 1/4 of country governments are putting their domestic resources at the levels that have been benchmarked globally for education, there's definitely a lack of resources there from the domestic side, and we have that mirrored from the global level in terms of aid to education as well, where I think we've talked about the aid issue already as well. And then the third piece of the triad that they've emphasized is around capacity, and the capacity to engage and deliver accountability systems is a key piece of the puzzle as well. So I think if you just have the one element and the formal element of regulation, absolutely, an emphasis on that then does become about finger pointing and blame. But if those other elements of an accountability system are there, then there's much more potential to have it actually be transformative.
Okay. One last question for me before we open it up to the audience. One of the most hotly contested debates in this area is about the role of private education, private players, however you choose to frame that. And there was a slide there mentioning about that in a rather neutral way. And of course, you could see this from the perspective of this being a sort of market failure. There should be more people from the private sector involved. Conversely, you could see that as being the worst possible thing to have the private sector in, because that prices people out and crowds out the public sector. I know there are lots of very, very strongly held views on this. So I wonder what you think about the relationship between this issue about access to education and the private sector.
That was one of the most hotly contested pieces when we were talking to a variety of actors about the draft recommendations, about what should this report be saying about that. And there certainly had people on the side of the debate that were saying, the role of accountability with private providers is really about creation of an enabling framework and a space for more engagement, versus others who were really saying it needs to be about being restrictive. It needs to be about making sure that the focus is on the right to a free, quality education. And if private providers aren't playing a role in that, are limiting that right, then their engagement needs to be really, really curtailed. So I don't know that, I think that this is such a live debate, and I'm actually really interested to hear from folks in the audience. I see a few of you who are very engaged in that at the moment, and how your thoughts about accountability frameworks play out there. And I think there's no clear answers, and it's as live a debate in a place like the UK as it is in a place like Kenya or India.
What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, obviously UK context, I think, is very different. I mean, you quoted Chile earlier, where there's the two very, very different ones in that context. If I just pull out one thought on it, I think, which is about essentially the stuff that's been in the news recently about university entrance, and particularly in terms of pupils from minority ethnic groups to Oxbridge and so on. One figure that isn't often quoted for is there are quite a number of parents that switch their students from public to private education for sixth form. And I guess that's because they think they've more chance of getting them into more what they might term elite universities and so on. I mean, analysis of data seems to suggest that maybe, the fact that a lot more children from private schools get into, or public schools as they're called in the UK, which is confusing, I know, get into Oxbridge, for example. Half of that is broadly that they tend to have higher level attainment for the same attainment at GCSE. Those in public schools tend to have slightly higher level attainment. Half of it is that, but half of it is, we think, more down to the fact that public schools have had that relationship with Oxbridge, so they're better at helping their students to cope with the interview process and so on and so forth. So there are some quite complex things that when you actually start to dig underneath what the differences might be. But would you allow me for a more? I was hoping to just come back in on your question about should you point the finger? Because, I think I've often thought, I mean, when I was teaching, when I was running an advisory and so on, I was just thinking, in the end, what's the important thing here? The important thing here is, are the children we're working with making appropriate progress and achieving the things we want them to achieve? And if you have to point the finger somewhere to achieve that, then you should do that. But the key bit is the context and how that's done. So, again, I quite like illustrating with examples, and I think it illustrates also the need to be a little more sophisticated about, at least the dangers of crude use of data. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember, but back in 2003, David Blunkett was Secretary of State for Education in the UK, and there was a rule that said if schools were below the floor target 3 years on the run, they will be closed. And there was absolutely that was it. There was nothing else was going to happen. And I got asked to go and do an analysis for DFE to look at value added for schools like that. Because at that point, DFE didn't have contextual value added. We did the FFT stuff because we were independent of government, so we could do what we liked. And that analysis actually showed that of schools below that floor target, there were about 20% of them, but they were actually in the top quartile for pupil progress. They just had a very low attaining intake. And interestingly, that was in the April-May. That summer, in June, it was David Miliband that particularly picked up on this. David Miliband invited 300 schools with the best value added together to show what they've been doing. 5 of those schools were schools that would have been closed under that floor target thing. And over the summer, the legislation was changed. It now became, if they're below the floor target, well, some might be closed. Oh, we might work with some in this way, we might work with some in this way. And some of those schools have gone on to improve at a very fast rate of knots because they got some feedback that said, actually, you're not horrendous. You can improve, but you're already doing well in some areas. So I think for me, pointing the finger is fine and saying, look, there appears to be an issue here. It's what you follow it with. It's whether you follow it with I'm just going to look at the data and say you should be closed, or whether it's I'm going to look at the data, work with you in a diagnostic way. If that proves to be problematic, then we might still close you. But it might, in most cases, 80%, it leads to real improvement. Okay. So I've no problem with pointing the finger. It's the context and how it's done that matters.
Okay. Well, back to the private players. What do you think?
Well, this is, as Susan talked about, quite a contentious issue, and we've had internal conversations but haven't quite decided where exactly we fit on this. But when we look at, I think when we think about private education, we think about, does it help the most marginalized, and does it align with kind of the national commitments and goals of the country? So I think that's typically where we start. And most of the research, when we think about markets and private education, shifting education towards really a private good, and we think about the initial creation of UNESCO and our report as looking at education from a rights-based public good perspective, we see some conflict there. And then we think about, okay, well, a private good means basically that individuals are paying for their education, and regardless of how low fee that is, we know that that leaves out somebody. And so that's when we start getting a little concerned. So in this report, when we talk about private provision of education, we really go back to regulations. And as I mentioned before, one of the things on accountability has been this rapid expansion of enrollment and access, which is wonderful, but that often outpaces really the government's ability to provide quality education for these individuals. And that's led to some concerns on the quality of public schooling and kind of this mushrooming of other different types of schooling, whether it's NGOs or private, for-profit, private, or community-based schools. The challenge with that, and the thing we try to highlight here, is as expansion is happening, we need the government needs to not just have the capacity to inspect, but they need to make sure there are proper regulations in place, because oftentimes these schools that are potentially popping up in some areas need different regulations. So they're not the typical, what we think of like as a high-performing, high-fee private school. And so they need different regulations, but they need regulations. And so, for instance, in Lagos, Nigeria, we know that even though they had regulations, only 26% of private schools were basically meeting regulations and being approved by the government. We know once regulations happen in Kenya, some low-fee private schools there are being closed down by the government, and that was supported by the courts in Kenya and Uganda. And so really, I think it goes back to, are they aligning with the aims? I think if we have private provision, it still needs to be moving towards what's the country has decided is what's best for them. And are we leaving people behind? And so I think we still have a lot to do to search in and look through private provision in education, but I think we start with those two questions and then evaluate from there.
Okay. And we say we might get some thoughts from the audience.